The crimson dawn of Nethys painted the fog in shades of rust and blood. But Cale Thorne barely noticed the beauty anymore. For 3 years, the toxic mists had been his only companion on this forsaken moon, and he had learned to read their moods. Like an old lover's sighs, today, something was different. The bioscanner in his makeshift laboratory was shrieking in alarm. That cut through the perpetual silence like a blade through silk. Cal's weathered hands moved across the device's surface, his brow furrowing as the reading stabilized. A complex, life signature, definitely sentient, and fading fast. His heart hammered against his ribs as memories threatened to surface, memories of another time, another world, when he had sworn oaths to preserve life wherever he found it. Those oaths had cost him everything: his career, his reputation, his place in civilized society. But apparently, they still had their claws in him. The outer seal of his habitat hissed as he prepared to venture into the poisonous embrace of Nethys. His environmental suit was a patchwork of salvaged components and jury-rigged modifications, but it had kept him alive through countless excursions into the moon's lethal atmosphere. The fog rolled around him like a living thing as he stepped onto the corroded metal grating that served as his front porch, its tendrils seeming to taste his presence before reluctantly parting. Following the scanner's ping, Cale made his way through the twisted landscape of crystalline formations and bubbling toxic pools. The silence was absolute except for the steady rhythm of his breathing apparatus and the soft splash of his boots in the acidic puddles that dotted the terrain. Nethys was beautiful in its way, a symphony of chemical reactions that painted the landscape in impossible colors, but it was also utterly hostile to most forms of life. The signature led him to a crater roughly a kilometer from his habitat, a depression in the moon's surface where the fog collected like water in a bowl. And there, sprawled against the jagged crystal formations at the crater's edge, was something that made Kel's breath catch in his throat. She was magnificent even in her broken state. Her skin was a deep burgundy that seemed to absorb the wan light of Nethys' distant star, and her hair fell around her shoulders like liquid amber shot through with threads of gold. The remains of what had once been an elaborate uniform clung to her frame, rich fabric worked with metallic threads and studded with gems that still glinted, despite being caked with the moon's corrosive mud. But it was her ears that confirmed what Cale had already suspected. Pointed and elegant, they marked her as Xerion, one of the proud warrior nobles from the Galactic Core. What was a member of the Imperial family doing on this toxic backwater? And more importantly, what had reduced her to this pitiful state? Cale approached cautiously, his medical training warring with his hard-learned instinct for self-preservation. The Xerion Empire had been responsible for the war that had destroyed his former life, that had turned him from a respected xenobiologist into a bitter exile. But as he knelt beside the unconscious woman, professional instincts took over. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, each exhalation creating small puffs of vapor in the toxic air. Multiple lacerations covered her exposed skin, and a particularly nasty wound on her left arm was weeping a fluid that glowed with an unnatural phosphorescence. More troubling still was the way her skin seemed to be breaking down at the cellular level, as if the moon itself was slowly dissolving her from the outside in. Cal's scanner confirmed his worst fears. The atmospheric composition of Nethys, harmless to his human physiology, was acting like a slow poison to her alien biology. Without immediate intervention, she would be dead within hours. For a moment, he hesitated. This woman was his enemy, or at least represented everything he had learned to hate about the galaxy. Beyond Nethys, the Xerion Empire had shown no mercy to the colonies that had dared to resist their expansion, had branded him a war criminal for trying to save lives during their brutal pacification campaigns. What did he owe her? But as he looked down at her face, peaceful in unconsciousness, but marked by pain and exhaustion, Cale found his answer. He owed her nothing, but he owed something to the man he had once been, the healer who had sworn to preserve life regardless of politics or species. That man might have been naive, but he had also been better than the bitter hermit Cale had become. Lifting her proved more difficult than expected. Despite her apparent delicacy, she was surprisingly heavy, her dense musculature speaking to a lifetime of physical training. Kale staggered under her weight as he began the treacherous journey back to his habitat, the fog seeming to thicken around them as if resenting this intrusion into its domain. By the time he reached his airlock, Kel's legs were trembling with exhaustion and his suit's environmental systems were working overtime to keep him conscious. The decontamination cycle seemed to take forever. Harsh lights and chemical sprays working to neutralize the worst of the moon's toxic embrace before they could enter his living space. Inside, Kel's habitat was a study in organized efficiency. Every surface served multiple purposes. Every tool had its place. The main living area doubled as his laboratory, while the small sleeping alcove could be converted into a makeshift medical bay. It was here that he carefully placed his unexpected patient, his hands already moving to strip away the remnants of her ruined clothing. The extent of her injuries became clear as he worked. In addition to the obvious wounds, her entire body was showing signs of systematic cellular breakdown. Her immune system was fighting a losing battle against Nethys' unique brand of atmospheric poison, and conventional medical treatment would be useless. But Kale was far from conventional. 3 years of isolation had taught him to see the moon not as an enemy, but as a complex ecosystem with its own brutal logic. And in that ecosystem, he had discovered something remarkable, a species of crystalline moss that not only survived, but thrived in Nethys' toxic environment. Working through the night, Kale ground samples of the moss into a luminescent paste, his fingers moving with the steady precision of long practice. The cure was theoretical at best, based on his understanding of both Xerian physiology and the moss's unique biochemical properties. But theory was all he had, and time was running out. As the first pale light of Nethys' dawn began to filter through the habitat's reinforced windows, Kale stood over his patient with a bowl of glowing paste in his hands. In a few hours, she would either begin to recover or slip away forever. Either way, his life of comfortable isolation was over. The woman stirred as he approached, her eyes fluttering open to reveal irises the color of molten copper flecked with gold. For a moment, they stared at each other across the gulf of species and circumstance that separated them. Then her lips parted, and she spoke a single word in the melodious language of the Xerian nobility. Why? Kale looked down at the glowing paste in his hands, then back at her face. Because someone has to, he said simply, and began to apply the cure to her wounds. Princess Xera Valdris had awakened to find herself in hell, or at least that's what her pride insisted as she stared up at the alien face hovering above her. The human's features were weathered and marked by solitude, his gray eyes holding depths she couldn't fathom, but it was his hands that commanded her attention, gentle despite their obvious strength, applying some sort of luminescent substance to her wounds with practiced precision. "Stay still," he murmured in accented Xerian, his pronunciation clumsy but understandable. "This will help with the cellular degradation." Xera's warrior instinct screamed at her to strike, to assert dominance over this lesser being who dared to touch her royal person without permission. But her body betrayed her, weakness flooding her limbs like liquid lead. The shame of it burned. Worse than her injuries, she, who had commanded fleets and conquered star systems, reduced to helplessness in the hands of a primitive human. "I am Princess Xera Valdris of the Xerian Empire," she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Daughter of Emperor Thane the Conqueror." You will be quiet," Kale interrupted, not looking up from his work. "Your titles mean nothing here. On Nethys, you're just another patient fighting for her life." The casual dismissal of her birthright sent a surge of rage through Xera's system, momentarily overriding her weakness. She tried to sit up, tried to summon the commanding presence that had cowed generals and nobles alike. Instead, she managed only to lift her head a few centimeters. Before collapsing back onto the narrow cot, Kale glanced at her with something that might have been amusement. "The paste needs time to work. Fighting it will only slow your recovery. I would rather die than accept charity from," Xera began. But Kale cut her off with a look that silenced her more effectively than any rebuke. "From what? A human, a commoner, an exile." His voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in those gray eyes. "I've heard all the Xerian slurs for my species, Princess, but right now, this lesser being is the only thing standing." Between you and a very unpleasant death, the truth of his words settled over her like a weight. Zara closed her eyes, trying to process the impossible situation she found herself in. The last thing she remembered clearly was her ship's hull breaching, under enemy fire, alarms screaming as she fought to reach the escape pods. After that, only fragments the searing pain of atmospheric entry, the sensation of falling, the gradual realization that she was dying alone on a world that wanted nothing more than to dissolve her into its toxic embrace. Why? She asked again, the question carrying more weight than before. Why save me? Cale was silent for a long moment, his hands never pausing in their work. Because I used to be someone who saved lives, he said finally. Before your empire decided, I was a war criminal for treating the wounded regardless of which side they fought for. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Zara studied his face, noting the lines of old pain around his eyes, the careful way he held himself apart from the world. Here was a man who had lost everything, yet still chose to heal rather than harm. My father would call you soft, she said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. And I would call him a tyrant, Cale replied without heat. But neither of our opinions matter much out here. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of necessity and gradual trust. Cale's miraculous moss paste was indeed healing her, the cellular breakdown reversing as her body learned to process Nephis' toxic atmosphere. But recovery was slow, and Zara found herself dependent on her unlikely savior for everything from food to basic mobility. The dependence galled her. She had been raised to command, to never show weakness, to view any form of vulnerability as a betrayal of her royal blood. Yet here she was, accepting spoonfuls of nutrient paste from a human's hands, allowing him to help her to the small waste facilities when her legs wouldn't support her weight. You were military, she observed one evening, watching Cale clean and maintain his equipment with methodical precision. I can see it in the way you move, the way you organize your space. Cale nodded without looking up from the bioscanner he was calibrating, xenobiological cores attached to the 3rd Colonial Defense Fleet. Before that, I was a research scientist on New Geneva. What happened? The Zirian expansion reached our sector. His voice remained neutral, but Zara could hear the controlled emotion beneath the surface. Your people classified medical aid to insurgents as treason. I disagreed. Zara felt an unfamiliar sensation, shame, sharp and bitter in her throat. She had been present at many of the strategic meetings that had shaped that campaign, had even advocated for some of the harsher measures her father's generals had proposed. The idea that her decisions might have destroyed innocent lives had never occurred to her. In the imperial court, collateral damage was simply the price of order and progress. I'm sorry, she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. A Zirian princess did not apologize, especially not to lesser species. Cale looked up then, his gray eyes searching her face for sincerity. Are you? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear? The question stung because it forced her to examine her own motivations. Was this genuine remorse or simply another tactical maneuver? Zara realized with uncomfortable clarity that she wasn't entirely sure. I don't know, she admitted. In my world, we don't often consider the individual cost of our grand strategies. Perhaps we should. Something shifted in Cale's expression, a subtle softening that spoke of possibilities neither of them was ready to acknowledge. As her strength returned, Zara began to explore the small habitat that had become her prison and sanctuary. Cale's living space was a fascinating blend of scientific precision and desperate improvisation. Every surface served multiple functions. Every tool had been modified and re-modified to serve purposes far beyond their original design. But it was his collection of books and data tablets that truly captured her attention. Works of human philosophy and poetry mingled with technical manuals and scientific journals. Histories of a dozen species filled digital shelves alongside analysis of botanical specimens and atmospheric compositions. You're a scholar, she said, running her fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume of human verse. I was. Cale corrected from across the room, where he was tending to his hydroponic garden. Now I'm just a man trying to understand the universe that cast him out. Zara pulled the book from its place and opened it to a random page. The words were in an ancient human dialect. She recognized but couldn't read fluently. "What does this one say?" Cale looked over, his expression softening as he recognized the passage. "Do not go gentle into that good night," he quoted from memory. "Old age should burn and rave at close of day, rage against the dying of the light." The words resonated with something deep in Zara's chest, a recognition of the defiance that had led her to this place. "Is that what you're doing here, raging against the dying of the light?" "Maybe," Cale said, returning to his plants, "or maybe I'm just hiding from it." That night, for the first time since her rescue, Zara dreamed not of death and falling, but of gray eyes and gentle hands, and the possibility that strength might mean something other than conquest. Dave and Kor had been tracking his quarry across 3-star systems for the better part of a standard month, and his patience was wearing thin. The Zirian assassin prided himself on efficiency, clean kills, minimal collateral damage, jobs completed with surgical precision. But Princess Zara Valdris had proven annoyingly resilient, surviving an ambush that should have ended her miserable existence, and somehow making it to this toxic wasteland at the galaxy's edge, standing in the cramped bridge of his stealth corvette. Davin studied the sensor readings from Nethys with professional interest. The moon's atmosphere was so corrosive that most scanning equipment couldn't penetrate. More than a few kilometers into its dense fog layers, it was the perfect place to hide, assuming one could survive the environment long enough to matter. His employer, Lord Vex Malthorn, had been very specific about the princess's fate. She was to die slowly, aware of her circumstances, preferably in some form of poetic justice that would serve as a lesson to other potential rebels. Within the noble houses, Davin normally didn't care about his clients' motivations. Credits were credits, and the Zirian Empire's internal politics were none of his concern. But there was something about Malthorn that set his teeth on edge, a casual cruelty that went beyond mere ambition. "Sir?" His ship's AI interrupted his brooding with its usual mechanical politeness. "I've detected a faint energy signature from the surface. It appears to be artificial in origin, possibly a habitation module." Davin leaned forward, his scarred features hardening with anticipation. "Show me." The main screen flickered to life, displaying a wireframe representation of Nethys' surface. A small cluster of structures appeared near the moon's equator, barely registering against the background interference. It wasn't much, but it was the first solid lead he'd had since arriving in this forsaken system. "Prepare the drop pod," he ordered, already moving toward the ship's armory, "and scan for any other vessels in the area. I want to know if our princess has friends." 30 minutes later, Davin was plummeting through Nethys' toxic atmosphere in a heavily shielded insertion pod, his combat suit's environmental systems working overtime to keep him alive. The landing was rougher than he'd anticipated. The moon's gravity was lighter than standard, but the dense fog played havoc with the pod's guidance systems. He emerged into a world that looked like something from a fever dream. The fog swirled around crystalline formations that jutted from the ground like the bones of buried giants, while pools of luminescent liquid bubbled and steamed in the wan light of the system's distant star. It was beautiful in its way, but Davin had no time for sightseeing. His suit's sensors led him through the maze of rock formations and toxic pools. Following the faint energy trail toward its source, the readings grew stronger as he approached, confirming that someone was indeed maintaining technology on this desolate world. Whether that someone was harboring his target remained to be seen. The habitat, when he finally found it, was smaller than he'd expected, a jury-rigged assemblage of salvaged components that looked like it had been built by someone with more ingenuity than resources. Davin circled the structure carefully, his weapon drawn, looking for signs of the princess's presence. That's when he spotted them through one of the reinforced windows, two figures moving around the habitat's interior with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. One was clearly Zirian, her distinctive burgundy skin and amber hair unmistakable even through the distorted transparency. The other was human, tall and lean with graying hair and the careful movements of someone accustomed to working in confined spaces. Davin smiled beneath his helmet's faceplate. So the princess had found herself a pet human. How delightfully pathetic. This would make things interesting. Inside the habitat, Kale was teaching Zara the finer points of atmospheric chemistry. When his proximity alarms began to shriek, he froze, his blood turning to ice as he recognized the warning signals. Someone had breached the perimeter. "What is that?" Zara asked, her warrior instincts immediately alert. "Company," Kale said grimly, moving to a wall panel and activating the habitat's external sensors. The screens flickered to life, showing murky views of the surrounding landscape. At first, there was nothing but the usual swirling fog and crystalline formations. Then, like a ghost materializing from the mist, a figure in combat armor stepped into view. Zara's breath caught as she recognized the sleek, predatory lines of Zirian military gear. "Assassin," she whispered, her face going pale beneath her burgundy skin. "They found me." Kel's mind raced through their options, none of them good. The habitat had basic defensive systems, but they were designed to keep out the moon's toxic environment. Not determined killers, they had maybe minutes before. Their visitor found a way inside. "Is there another way out?" Zara asked, her royal training reasserting itself as she shifted into tactical mode. "Emergency airlock in the back," Kale said, already moving to gather essential supplies. "But it leads directly into the worst part of the toxic zone. Without proper gear, we'd be dead in minutes. Better than being murdered in our beds." Zara replied with grim pragmatism. Outside, Davin had found the habitat's primary airlock and was examining its security systems with professional interest. The locks were sophisticated, but not military-grade. He could breach them given time and the right tools. But as he worked, something nagged at him about the situation. The princess had been alone when her ship crashed, so where had the human come from, and why was he helping her? The first lock gave way with a soft hiss, followed by the second. Davin stepped into the airlock's cramped confines, his weapon at the ready. The inner door was tougher, reinforced against atmospheric pressure, but nothing his equipment couldn't handle. When the final barrier fell away, Davin stepped into what was clearly the main living area of the habitat. It was empty, but still, warm from recent occupation. Food preparations sat half-finished on a small table, and the air held the lingering scent of human and Zirian pheromones. "Interesting, Princess," he called out, his voice amplified by his suit's speakers. "I know. You're here. Lord Malthorn sends his regards." The silence that greeted his announcement was telling. They were hiding, probably trying to formulate some desperate escape plan. Davin allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction after weeks of chase. His quarry was finally cornered. He found them in the habitat's small laboratory, crouched behind a bank of scientific equipment. The human, clearly some sort of researcher, based on the surroundings, had positioned himself protectively in front of the princess, while she gripped what looked like an improvised energy weapon with white knuckles. "How touching," Davin said, raising his military-grade rifle. "The princess has found herself a champion. Tell me, human, do you know what you're dying for?" "Her name is Zara," Kale replied steadily, not moving from his protective position. "And I know exactly who she is, do you? Do you know she's responsible for the deaths of millions? That her family's empire is built on the bones of species that dared to resist their expansion?" Davin kept his weapon trained on them while he spoke, enjoying the psychological pressure. "You're protecting a war criminal, my friend." "No," Kale said quietly. "I'm protecting someone who deserves a chance to be more than her past." The simple conviction in the human's voice gave Davin pause. In his experience, people only defended the guilty when they were being paid handsomely for their services. But this man seemed genuinely committed to his principles, however misguided they might be. "Step aside," Davin ordered. "My quarrel is with the princess, not with you. Walk away, and you can live to contemplate the moral complexities of your choice." "No," the single word hung in the recycled air between them. Davin sighed, genuinely regretful. He respected courage, even when it was futile. "Then you die together," he said, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon's discharge lit up the small laboratory like lightning, but instead of the expected screams of the dying, Davin heard only the angry hiss of venting atmosphere. Somehow, impossibly, his shot had misdeflected by a piece of equipment that had been positioned with suspicious precision. "Now," Kale shouted, and suddenly the lab was filled with billowing clouds of some sort of chemical compound. Davin's suit's filters kicked in automatically, but his visibility dropped to near zero. In the chaos, he heard the sound of running feet and muttered curses. By the time the chemicals cleared, his quarry was gone. Davin stood alone in the ruined laboratory, surrounded by the debris of what had obviously been a carefully planned escape. The human had used his own equipment against him, turning scientific instruments into weapons and cover. Outside, the fog of Nethys swirled as if mocking his failure. Somewhere in that toxic maze, a princess and her unlikely protector were running for their lives. Davin shouldered his weapon and began to follow. The hunt was far from over. Lord Vex Malthorn descended from his personal shuttle like a plague-given form, his ornate armor gleaming with the accumulated wealth of a dozen conquered worlds. The noble's face was a masterwork of surgical enhancement and genetic modification, beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful, all sharp edges and perfect symmetry hiding something fundamentally rotten beneath. "Report," he commanded, not bothering to look at Davin as the assassin approached through the swirling mists of Nethys. "They escaped the habitat," Davin said, his professional pride stinging from the admission. "The human is more resourceful than anticipated. He's using the environment itself as a weapon." Malthorn's lips curved in what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. How deliciously ironic. The precious princess, reduced to cowering in the toxic waste of a dead moon, protected by a primitive who thinks chemistry can overcome superior breeding. He gestured expansively at the crystalline landscape around them. "Show me where they've gone." Davin activated a portable scanner, its display showing faint traces of their quarry's passage through the corrosive fog. "They're heading deeper into the canyon system. The atmospheric interference grows stronger there. It'll be harder to track them, but also harder for them to navigate." "Perfect," Malthorn purred. "Let them run themselves ragged in the maze. When they're exhausted and desperate, we'll corner them like the animals they've become." He turned to address the squad of elite soldiers who had accompanied him from the shuttle. "Deploy in a wide perimeter. Drive them toward the canyon's terminus. I want the princess to see her doom approaching slowly." As his men moved to comply, Malthorn allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction. For too long, Zara Valdris had been a thorn in his side, her stubborn refusal to accept his marriage proposal making him a laughingstock among the noble houses. Her father's subsequent exile order had been a gift from the gods. It gave him legal justification to pursue the arrogant bitch to the ends of the galaxy if necessary. But it wasn't just about wounded pride anymore. During their flight from the habitat, Malthorn had monitored the communications between the princess and her human pet. What he'd heard had implications far beyond personal revenge. Zara Valdris was changing, her royal arrogance softening into something dangerously close to compassion. If word of that transformation reached the imperial court, it might inspire other nobles to question the empire's brutal methods. No, she had to die here, on this poisonous rock, forgotten and unmourned, and her death would send a clear message to anyone else who might consider the path of weakness and mercy. Deep in the canyon system, Kale was discovering that desperation could be a powerful teacher. The narrow passages between the crystalline formations provided some protection from Malthorn's hunters, but they were also leading steadily toward a dead end, a sheer wall of toxic crystal that rose beyond the limits of their vision. "We're trapped," Zara said, voicing what they both already knew. Her breathing was labored from their desperate flight, and despite the healing properties of Kel's moss treatment, the sustained exposure to Nethys' atmosphere was taking its toll. Kale studied the canyon walls around them, his scientist's mind cataloging the various forms of life that had adapted to this hellish environment. The crystalline formations weren't just geological features, they were complex ecosystems, hosting dozens of species that had learned to thrive in conditions that would kill most other life forms. "Not trapped," he said slowly, an idea beginning to form, hidden. He pointed to the patches of glowing moss that covered much of the canyon's surface, their soft radiance providing the only light in the perpetual twilight of the depths. "Do you see the color variations?" The green moss is what saved your life. It converts the atmospheric toxins into harmless light. But the yellow patches, he smiled grimly. Those are something else entirely. Zara followed his gaze to the sickly, pale growths that clustered near the base of the canyon walls. What do? They concentrate the toxins instead of neutralizing them. When disturbed, they release spores that are corrosive enough to eat through military-grade armor. In minutes, Kel's expression was grim but determined. Your friend Malthorn wants to corner us here. Let's give him a welcome he won't forget. Working quickly, they began to set up Kel's improvised weapon system. Using components salvaged from his portable laboratory equipment, he fashioned small explosive charges designed to rupture the yellow moss clusters at precisely the right moment. It was a desperate gambit, but it was the only advantage their environment could provide. Will this kill them? Zara asked as she helped position the devices according to Kel's specifications. It'll give them something to think about, he replied. The spores are heavier than air. They'll sink to the canyon floor and create a toxic cloud. That should keep them at bay long enough for us to find another way out. And if there is no other way out, Kale met her golden eyes, seeing his own resignation reflected there. Then at least we die on our own terms. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the canyon like a death knell. Malthorn's forces were moving systematically through the passages, using military-grade scanners to track their quarry's heat signatures. Soon, very soon, they would round the final corner and find their prey waiting. Princess Zara, Malthorn's amplified voice boomed through the canyon, the sound bouncing off the crystal walls with mocking persistence. Surely you don't intend to hide from me like a common criminal. Show yourself, and I promise your death will be quick and clean. From their concealed position behind a cluster of crystal formations, Zara felt rage build in her chest like molten metal. I am a daughter of the Zirian Empire, she shouted back. I bow to no jumped-up merchant's son who bought his title with blood money. Malthorn's laughter was like breaking glass. Empire? What empire? You are nothing but a forgotten exile, clinging to the delusions of past glory. Your father has already erased you from the succession. When you die here, it will be as if you never existed at all. The words hit harder than any physical blow because they carried the ring of truth. Zara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her lost heritage settling over her like a shroud. Everything she had been, everything she had fought for, reduced to nothing by her father's political calculations. Then she felt Kel's hand cover hers. Warm and steady and utterly unimpressed by noble bloodlines or imperial politics. You exist, he said quietly, his voice carrying more conviction than all of Malthorn's threats. Here, now, with me, that's all that matters. The simple declaration shattered something inside her chest, replacing the cold weight of duty with something far more dangerous: hope. Come closer, Malthorn, she called out, her voice ringing with newfound strength. Let me show you what exile has taught me about survival. The Lord's ornate armor gleamed as he stepped into the killing ground. Flanked by his soldiers, their weapons were raised and ready, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They never saw Kel's fingers move across the detonator's surface, never noticed the scientist's grim smile as he triggered the charges. The canyon erupted in clouds of sickly yellow spores, billowing up from the disturbed moss clusters like the breath of some ancient, poisonous god. Malthorn's confident advance turned to chaos as his soldiers' armor began to smoke and corrode, the concentrated toxins eating through their protective gear. With terrifying efficiency, impossible, Malthorn roared, his voice distorting as his helmet's speakers began to fail. He stumbled backward, one gauntleted hand clawing at his throat as the spores found their way through compromised seals. Through the toxic haze, Zara emerged like an avenging spirit, her improvised weapon crackling with energy. She had shed the last vestiges of her royal conditioning, embracing instead the primal fury of someone fighting for something more precious than throne or title. This is what exile taught me, she snarled, driving her weapon toward Malthorn's exposed throat. This is what survival looks like when you have something real to protect. The Lord fell to his knees, his perfect features already beginning to blister from exposure to the spores. Round him, his elite soldiers lay incapacitated, their expensive armor reduced to corroding scrap metal dot as the toxic clouds began to settle. Kale emerged from cover, his face pale but triumphant. Together, they stood over their defeated enemies. Two outcasts who had found strength in each other that neither possessed alone. "It's over," Zara said, but her voice held no satisfaction, only weary relief. Kale nodded, then gestured toward the canyon's far wall. "Actually, I think it's just beginning. Look." Hidden behind the dissipating spores was something neither of them had noticed before: a narrow passage leading deeper into the canyon system, carved smooth by eons of chemical erosion. It was a way out, a path to whatever lay beyond this place of death and transformation. Hand in hand, they walked toward their uncertain future, leaving behind the broken remnants of the old world's cruelty. 6 months had passed since the toxic winds of Nethys had scattered Lord Malthorn's ambitions like dust, and Kale Thorne found himself facing a choice he had never expected to make. Standing in the bridge of the captured Xerian shuttle, he watched the star charts display dozens of possible destinations, each one representing a path away from the life they had accidentally built together. Zara stood beside him, her burgundy skin pale in the artificial light as she studied an encrypted message that had arrived through channels so clandestine it had taken their ship's AI 3 days to decode it. The communication bore the seal of her father's personal spymaster, and its contents had shaken her more than any assassin's blade. "He knows I'm alive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Emperor, my father, the evidence we found in Malthorn's files has cleared my name. I could go home." The word home hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. For 6 months, they had explored the uncharted regions beyond the galactic rim, cataloging new worlds and species, building something beautiful and fragile in the space between their old lives. Cal's scientific expertise had proven invaluable in navigating unknown systems, while Zara's tactical knowledge had kept them alive when they encountered less friendly civilizations. But beneath their successful partnership lay something deeper and more dangerous, a love that neither had expected and both feared to name. It had grown slowly, through shared dangers and quiet moments, through the gradual realization that they had become essential to each other's existence. "What does the message say exactly?" Kale asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Zara activated the holographic display, and her father's spymaster materialized in miniature form, his weathered features grave with the weight of imperial politics. The message was brief but devastating in its implications: full pardon, restoration of title, and a place at her father's side as he aged and contemplated succession. Everything she had lost, offered back to her on a silver platter. There was more. The Xerian Empire was changing, slowly but perceptibly, under the pressure of external threats and internal dissent. Progressive voices in the imperial court were calling for reform, for a more humane approach to governing their vast territories. Zara's experiences as an exile, her unique perspective on the Empire's failures, could be instrumental in shaping that change. "You have to go," Kale said, and the words felt like glass in his throat. "Your people need you. The galaxy needs voices like yours in positions of power." Zara turned to face him, her golden eyes bright with unshed tears. "And what about what I need?" The question broke something inside Kel's chest. For 6 months, he had watched her transform from an arrogant princess into someone capable of genuine compassion and wisdom. She had learned to see the universe through the eyes of those her empire had conquered, to value life and growth over dominance and control. The woman standing before him bore little resemblance to the dying exile he had found in the toxic wastes of Nethys. "I can't ask you to give up your heritage for me," he said. "I won't be responsible for denying the galaxy the leader you could become. You're not asking." Zara replied fiercely, "I'm choosing. Do you think I could go back to that gilded cage after everything we've shared? Do you think I could smile and nod while the Imperial Council debates which worlds to conquer next?" She moved closer, her hands framing his face with infinite tenderness. "I've spent my whole life serving an empire built on fear and violence. For the first time, I've found something worth protecting, something worth nurturing. I found love. Kale, real love, not the political alliances my father would arrange." The bridge fell silent except for the gentle hum of the ship's systems. Around them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human and Xerian hearts, breaking in the space between duty and desire. "There's another way," Kale said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "The message mentions reform, movements within the Empire. What if we could influence that change from the outside?" Zara's eyebrows rose in curiosity. "What do you mean?" Kale activated the star charts, zooming in on a region of space far from both the Xerian Empire and the human colonies. "We've discovered 17 new worlds in the past 6 months, 3 of them inhabited by species that have never encountered galactic civilization. We could establish ourselves as intermediaries, as protectors of first contact protocols." The idea was audacious in its scope. Instead of trying to reform the Empire from within, they could create something entirely new, a neutral organization dedicated to peaceful exploration and cultural exchange. It would be dangerous work, requiring them to stand between established powers and vulnerable civilizations, but it would also be meaningful in ways that court politics could never match. "An embassy of exiles," Zara mused, her eyes lighting up with the possibilities. "Protecting the weak from the strong, ensuring that first contact doesn't become first conquest." Exactly. And who better to lead such an organization than a former princess, who understands the cost of imperial ambition, and a former colonial researcher, who knows the value of scientific cooperation. For the first time since the message had arrived, Zara smiled, not the careful expression of royal diplomacy, but the genuine joy of someone who had found her true calling. "My father won't understand," she said to him. "This will look like I'm choosing exile over redemption." "Are you?" Kale asked gently. Zara considered the question seriously, her gaze drifting to the view screen where alien constellations painted patterns unknown to her. "Homeworld." "No," she said finally. "I'm choosing a different kind of service. Instead of expanding an empire, I want to protect those who would be consumed by it." She turned back to the communications console and began composing a reply to her father's. "Spy Master." The message was brief but unambiguous. She was honored by the Emperor's forgiveness, but respectful. Why decline his offer? She had found a different path, one that would serve the greater good rather than imperial glory. As she transmitted the message into the void, Kale felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying. They were truly free now, bound only by their love for each other and their shared commitment to something larger than themselves. "So," he said, moving to stand behind her chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Where do we begin?" Zara leaned back against him, her warmth seeping through the fabric of his shirt. "There's a system 3 days from here, the Ethon Nebula. Our sensors detected what might be artificial structures near the 4th planet. If there's a civilization there, they'll be our first test case." Kale pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. "Then let's go introduce ourselves to the galaxy." The ship's engines hummed to life as they plotted their course toward the Ethon Nebula. Neither of them knew what they would find there, what challenges awaited in the unexplored regions of space. But they faced the uncertainty together, 2 hearts beating in synchrony as they flew toward their chosen destiny. Years later, when the Valdris Thorn Accords would be studied in diplomatic academies across the galaxy, scholars would debate the exact moment when everything changed. Some would point to the first successful mediation between the crystalline architects of Kepler Prime and the expanding human colonies. Others would cite the peaceful resolution of the Andromeda succession crisis, when Princess Zara's diplomatic skills prevented a war that could have consumed 3-star systems. But those who knew them best understood that the real transformation had begun in the toxic mists of Nethys, when a broken healer chose to save a dying princess. And she chose to let herself be saved. Everything else, the interstellar peace treaties, the cultural exchange programs, the network of protected worlds that stretched across the galactic rim, had simply grown from that first moment of connection between 2 souls who refused to let the universe's cruelty have the final word. In the end, they had found something more precious than empire or exile. They had found each other, and in doing so, had discovered that love was indeed the most powerful force in the galaxy, capable of healing ancient wounds, bridging impossible differences, and transforming even the most unlikely outcasts into agents of hope and change. The stars watched over them as they flew toward their next adventure, to hearts united in purpose, ready to face whatever challenges awaited in the vast, beautiful darkness of space.